are recording the interview of Robert Weisgarber. This interview is being conducted by David Berry from the Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University's New Media Incubator in Dayton, Ohio. It is 11 a.m. on March 23rd, 2018. Well, why don't we begin with where and when were you born?
Okay, yeah, I was born in a week ago, or a few days ago, March 21st, 1952, in actually Rockwood, Tennessee. But then my parents relocated from Tennessee to Ohio when I was about 6 months old. So.
And did they move for work? Or?
It was work related, yeah. I think part of the big migration north from the South after World War II for jobs. So.
Yeah. That kind of leads me into my next question. Who were your parents and what were their occupation?
Yeah, well, my parents, he was Robert also, Weisgarber, and my mother, Claudia McCormick Weisgarber, and they came up here in 1953 or so. And my father, he was a truck driver. He drove for a gasoline transport truck for his whole career. And my mother was in retail sales. She worked for different retail establishments like Kmart, Shoppers Fair was a store here, and then she eventually had her own retail store, women's clothes, that she sold for a number of years, and then sold that when she retired.
Did you have any siblings?
Two sisters, one both younger than me, one year younger than me, and the other one 2 years younger than me, so, or 3 years, excuse me, 3 years younger than me. So.
Were you guys pretty close then, since you were so close?
Yeah, I fairly, but like most siblings, I guess, we got along well, but but we had our own friends and stuff, and I think we were fairly close. So.
Did either of your parents or either of your sisters join the military?
No, my sisters didn't for sure. My father didn't either. He would have been a World War II era, but his family, he grew up in eastern Tennessee, and he had quit school in the 8th grade to work in his father's sawmill. And when he was 16, he had his arm mutilated with a saw. So he was he kept his arm, but it was crooked, and so he was 4F. And but I had on my father's side, I had one career military. His older brother was in the Navy for 20-something years, and then he had another brother who was killed at St. Lo, in about 6 days after D-Day in 1944.
So what were you doing before you joined the military?
I was in high school, and I was a senior in high school, and I decided, my family was pretty much I call it lower middle class or working class, however you want to describe it, but school wasn't anything much talked about. We grew up in East Kettering, and college wasn't anything much talked about. So graduated from high school, it was go to work at the GM plant, go to work at the Frigidaire plant, or join the service. And I took the service route. So, and I think I enlisted after my 18th birthday when I was still a senior, but I didn't report until toward the end of the summer for that year, 1970. So.
So were there any motivation or motivators for you to join?
I think the only motivators were, it was during the Vietnam War, and so, you kind of feel like you want to be a part of something. I wouldn't call it overt patriotism. It was more an adventure. You wanted to do something, and, hopefully, something bigger than yourself. I'd had another uncle who was career Navy on my mother's side. He was in the Navy then, and my mother really wanted me to join the Navy, but I actually preferred to, the Army, and ended up going that route.
So why the Army?
Well, I think more you kind of rank them. I think it's probably no truth to it, but you rank them kind of, okay, how hard or difficult are they? And you think, okay, the Air Force, they call it the country club type of thing, and then the Navy, a lot of times on ships, a lot of times at sea. and a little more difficult. The Army was, I thought the third most difficult, or the second to large, second to difficult, and then with Marines being the most difficult. But the Army seemed a more logical choice for me, just I think based upon that what I saw as perhaps opportunities for me in the service. So.
Were you worried about the draft at all, or did that even come into your mind?
Well, the draft was going on, and I wasn't worried about it because I think the year I turned 18 is when they had the lottery number in that system, and they picked the numbers, and I had a high lottery number, so I knew I wasn't going to get drafted, so but I decided I wanted to be in the military, so I'd already, whether I had a low number or a high number, I was pretty well determined I was going to join the Army.
So you said that your mom was leaning more towards for you to join the Navy, like your uncle.
Yeah.
How did your father or sister, or how did your other family members feel?
I think my father's, hey, you got to do what you think is best for you, and I think he always felt some guilt in not being able to serve because of his injury. So I think he was proud of the fact that I did want to serve in whatever capacity. My sisters were saying, "Nah, don't do it," and I know when I left, my youngest sister, who was probably 15 when I left, she was very upset and crying a lot. But overall they were supportive. So.
Were they worried that you chose the Army?
I don't think they were worried. I think my mother's more worried. Oh, you're going to end up in Vietnam, and that's why she wanted me to join the Navy, because she thought it would be a safer alternative.
So you said you had a kind of the summer off after you graduated high school before you left for basic. Did you have any fond memories, or did you go out and party or anything?
I guess some. I don't recall a lot of the details, but it was, I knew I was going to go in the Army, and I had several other friends who were going in the Army, and some were going on to college. So it was a mix. I worked all through high school, so I still had my part-time job where I worked pretty much full-time during the summer just to save up as much money as I could, because I knew I would probably need some, and then didn't travel or anything. That wasn't even anything I thought about. It was just more like hanging around waiting for the summer in. So when my date to show up, came around, I'd be ready to go.
So what happened when you got on the bus to head for basic training?
Yeah, because I joined here in Dayton, and so and I don't remember a lot of details, but I think there were 8 or 10 of us that day. It must have been a Thursday or Friday. It was right before Labor Day, I know that. And so we were in like a minivan, and they took us down to the Cincinnati airport to catch a flight. And but I remember sitting on the bus, and we all have a little longer hair and stuff, and different ages. 18, I was toward the younger end, but there were a few other guys who were mid-20s. And I remember just driving down to Cincinnati, people they'd see the bus, they'd blow their horns or wave at us or whatever, and then we ended up at the airport, and there was one guy who was older. He's about 30. I think he'd been in their service before and was re-entering service, and since he seemed to be the adult in the group, the NCO put him in charge of making sure we all got on the plane, and I think we flew to St. Louis. I'm not sure, but I think it was St. Louis because we had basic training at Fort Leonard Wood.
Yeah. So how would you describe basic training?
Yeah, I'd say in some ways it seemed very challenging to me. I wasn't an athlete or anything in high school, but I was for an 18-year-old in fairly good shape. So I'd say as far as getting through the physical training parts were some were a challenge, but overall, I was probably in the middle of the pack most of the time. I guess what was somewhat surprising was the amount of classroom activity we had in basic training and in doing things. So you'd have days where you were, physically training, either marching or running or, obstacle course, and then you'd have 2 or 3 days where you were more, learning Army, different things about the Army, and then taking apart your weapons, putting them together, and then going to the firing range, things like that. So.
Was there anything that helped you like get through it or help motivate you?
Well, I think the big motivator was you didn't want to not do it because it'd be so embarrassing. so I mean, because I remember this would have been September, October of 1970, the time period, and so I remember a few people in my training company who weren't in real good shape, and just were kind of strange guys, and they then they couldn't keep up, and they'd be put in a motivational platoon or something, so and that it just seemed embarrassing, and it seemed upsetting, so you didn't want to be that guy. you wanted to make sure you got through it, and you were, as you progressed, you hit that point where you're going to get through it, and everything's going to be okay, and then it kind of perks you up a bit, and when you're marching by and you're in the 7th week and you see the new recruits in the 1st week, they're looking at you guys like wow, we'll never get there, but same way that we looked at them when others before us when we were first starting out. So.
Did you have any drill sergeants that were memorable or gave you any words of wisdom?
Well, there were a couple drill sergeants, 2 or 3. I don't. Unfortunately, it was 48 years ago, so I don't remember their names. But I remember one drill sergeant. He was the senior drill sergeant, and I think he was an E7 or E8, and a big old guy. But he seemed to defy some of the military in that he had a big handlebar mustache that he kept curled up above his lip. So somehow he was able to keep that, but so he was, real loud, and there was another drill sergeant who I can't remember his name, but he was a sergeant first class, and he was just a tough guy and in shape, and he was always running with us and keeping us up. And he thought, man, this guy can, this old guy he's probably 35, he can do it. We can do it. And then a year or so later, I was just reading the Army Times. I saw he was named Drill Sergeant of the Year and unfortunately I don't remember his name. And there was one other drill sergeant he had been a draftee, I think, and he was just filling out the rest of his time, and he had a very lackadaisical approach to things. Then I saw, before we graduated from basic, he had been arrested in an FBI sting where he was selling weapons out of the armory where he'd gotten caught. So there was a mix of people.
So did you get to pick your job before going to basic training, or did you get told what your job was?
I picked, and being, young and 18 and thinking you're invincible, I said, I requested, 11 Bravo infantry, and didn't know if that was going to happen or not. And but then halfway through basic training, you're taking the aptitude test and stuff, and you don't know where you're going to end up. And then myself and a few other guys, they called us to a meeting and said, hey, we have an opportunity here if you're interested. It's I think it was 55 Delta was the MOS. It was EOD specialist, and it'd be for a bomb disposal. And they explained it all, and they explained that it was a volunteer. You had to sign a volunteer statement. We couldn't force anyone to do it, but if you wanted to do it, you could. And you thought about it. I said, that might be something different. It's not quite the same as what I thought it was going to, my Army experience was going to be. So I signed up for that, and being again young, and I think at the time, E1 or E2, I think our pay was $120 a month was the base pay, and if you're an EOD, you had hazardous duty pay, and that was an extra $55 a month. So that was almost a 50% increase in pay. So it sounded like a good deal. So I did sign up for that, and I got accepted into the EOD program. So after basic.
So did you go immediately to the EOD program after
Yeah,
you
yeah.
graduated?
After I graduated from basic training, and then in November, it was like a two-prong or two segments. We had 2 or 3 weeks in Fort McClellan, Alabama, for chemical warfare training and things like that, and then we went from there for all the EOD training for all those services were at Indian Head, Maryland. It was a Navy base, and so then we were there for, it was either 12 or 16 weeks. I don't remember exactly, but we finished up in I think late January or early February of 1971, and then from there I went to my first assignment.
So during all this training that you're doing right now, how was it adapting to military life?
You know, it wasn't hard, and one thing that, again, 18 and young and stupid, after basic training, my girlfriend and I got married, and so we got married after basic training, so we were actually living in married student housing at the Indian Head, Maryland. So I didn't have the barracks life so much there when I was in my training, but you know, it was in you know, old military housing. But yeah, I think adapting to the military life wasn't a problem. I think there's a little bit of you know, conformity. You know, you gotta, everyone has to conform to certain things. You know, you had to keep your hair short. You know, watch what you say. You know, and but I think it was easy enough. The EOD training was more like it was an intense instructional 4 months. So you're in the classroom a lot, a little bit in the field, blowing up, you know, or discovering unexploded ordnance and then deciding how to blow it up in place, things like that. But it was that was intense, and it was a hard program. I think, you know, maybe 25–30% of the people who enrolled in it, you know, didn't make it through it. You know, they flunked out. So.
How did your wife feel about you switching from infantry, which is already a dangerous job,
Yeah.
to EOD, which is an extremely
I
dangerous
think, you know,
job?
I think it's just all kind of more of a, you know, it wasn't a concrete type of thing that we knew what it really meant, or she didn't know. We were in the Army, you know, and she didn't care for the Army that much. So you know, she wasn't a big supporter, but you know, of the Army in general. But she was happy to do what I wanted to do, and but you know, we'll fast forward to it later. But you know, their marriage was over in 2 years anyway.
So you said that you finished training in '71 and then went to your first duty station.
I did, yeah.
What was that first duty station?
Yeah, and it was different because, you know, it wasn't the typical Army experience where you're on a big base like Fort Bragg or Fort Benning or something. I went to Valley Forge General Hospital, which is just outside of Philadelphia, about 20 miles, and it was a large military hospital. At the time, it was getting a lot of Vietnam vets, because Vietnam soldiers who'd been injured in battle, and they dealt a lot with amputees and stuff. So it was a hospital that had been built in the 40s. It was all wooden floors and stuff, and there was an MP unit there, and then we were there, and our main goal was to kind of serve as to help deal with work with the Philadelphia Police Department and stuff, because a lot of police departments at the time didn't have a special bomb unit or anything. So we would get called out every time there was some suspicious activity or something like that, and then we would do training too. But we rarely went to any major base like Fort Dix or anything. So it was a little different experience.
Now, I'm sure there's incidences that you can't talk about, but were there any times that you got called out to a call for the police department that was that stands out, or was?
Yeah, there were a couple. I know one was I'd been there about 6 months, and we got a call that there was a bomb threat had come in to this paint manufacturing company where an employee had called in saying I planted a bomb, and it's going to go off. So myself and the captain, we went on the call. And the funny part of it is, we're there, and there was a bomb. It was like a gallon paint can filled with liquid, and it had a blasting cap and electrical devices. And so they showed us where it is and where they're looking at it. And there's a couple cops looking over our shoulders and said, "Well, what's going on? What's going to happen? Do you think it could blow up?" And the captain's there looking at it. He goes, "Well, if it does, you're going with it because you're right behind us." So that kind of backed them off real quick, but it was a real simple device, and we even I knew what to do to cut the wires so that so that it wouldn't be dangerous. And we had several of those incidents like that, but nothing that ever blew up. We'd also get cases where this is like 20 to 30 years, I guess 30 years after World War II, and someone, a veteran has died or something, and then they find an old hand grenade or something in his footlocker, that his kids or something going through, so we'd get called out to have to dispose of that. Another part of EOD was to serve as adjunct to the Secret Service. If they had visiting dignitaries or stuff, we would go out and sweep the area for in any possible explosives or anything like that. So we got called out several times to go to DC or something if someone was visiting to work with an embassy or something.
So how long did you stay at this duty station?
I was there I got there in January, February of '71, and then I got orders to go to South Korea, to the 8th Army in February of '72, and so I left for South Korea then. So.
And did you feel like that the year, or all your training and then the year at the duty station did you feel prepared?
It was entirely different because I was assigned to the 8th EOD, which was, we were at a small ammo dump, the 696 ammunition facility, which was outside of Camp Red Cloud, which is up at Weisgarber, Korea, and just south of Camp Casey. So we were up close to the DMZ, and so all the work done there was more in support of the 2nd Infantry Unit, or 2nd Infantry Division. But there was a lot of unexploded ordnance and stuff we'd find from the Korean War that we'd have to go out when they were constructing new work or something. We'd have to go out and dispose of that. But this work was a lot more military oriented, that we were disposing of a lot of out-of-date ammunition and artillery shells and things like that. So it was a lot of work on the artillery range and stuff, blowing up things, and then working with the local, the 2nd Infantry Division. Whenever they had maneuvers or something, we'd go out and just be on call in case there was an incident or something like that.
Well, I know with my experience with EOD over in Afghanistan, there'd be a lot of incidents where we'd call them out and they'd blow something up, and we'd be a couple 100 meters back, but we would still have large pieces of shrapnel fly by our heads.
Yeah.
And did any situation like that ever come up with you when you were blowing up some ordnance?
We did, but nothing where any got injured. And just for clarification for people who, it wasn't like Jeremy Renner in the Hurt Locker, we didn't have any we didn't wear any of those armor suits, or and we were basically just in our fatigues and out there working, and it was we didn't have the robots or anything like that, so we had to eyeball everything and walk up and do it. But safety was always the number one issue. So when we were disposing of ammunition and artillery shells and things like that, we kept people pretty far away. But it was difficult in some ways in that this was just an Army ammo dump, but it was accessible to the local Korean population, and scrap metal was a big thing. And so, when we weren't around, the local population would be out collecting the metal casings and stuff like that, because then they could turn around and sell it in the market for money to help support themselves. And there were, I think, 2 incidents where people actually picked up a round that hadn't exploded, and then it would explode, and so they were either injured or killed. So it was dangerous in that sense. So.
Were most of your detonations on base and controlled deaths, or would you have to go out on missions from time to time? And
Most were controlled. I think there were 2 or 3 that were in more of a civilian area where we'd have to work. The military police would work in conjunction with the Korean police to cordon off the area, and we always wanted to try and blow it in place rather than try and cart it and move it. But at the time, and this was 1972 in Korea, so it was a little different than today in that it was there's a curfew from midnight to 5 a.m. every day. So everyone had to be off, not just military people, everyone, military and civilian people were off the streets from midnight to 5 in the morning. We got paid in military script, not U.S. dollars, and because they didn't want the U.S. dollars floating around and with the local population. So there was, President Park was the dictator at the time in Korea. So it was a strong military dictatorship when we were there. So it was not as open as it is today in Korea. So.
I mean, I'm sure with you being EOD, every aspect of your job was dangerous, but was there ever one aspect of it that you felt was more dangerous, or you just didn't like to do, or?
Nothing I didn't like to do. I think the only part that would be most is when you're out there and if you're setting the explosion, and you're crimping the blasting cap to the and sticking it in the C4 and then running the detonating cord. There's always that moment you think, is it going to be a fast burning fuse? Am I going to have time to walk away? Because we always wanted it long enough where you don't have to run. You wanted it to so you're safe. So you got plenty of time to move back to a controlled area behind sandbags or behind a berm or something. But most of it wasn't. I think it was pretty well organized. I think one time there was and I wasn't involved in it, but there had been a train that had wrecked in South Korea, in the southern part of South Korea, and the other EOD unit in the country, they actually handled that, but that was more of having to dig through rubble and train cars and stuff to make sure that all the ammunition was found. So, but I never felt much in fear for my life or anything like that. So.
You had mentioned the Hurt Locker movie earlier. After watching that, did you look back and was there any of that safety equipment that we have today that you wished that you had when you were in?
Well, I thought the robotics was pretty cool. Where you can run the robot up and and you have the camera and you can kind of eyeball it, and see what it is. So, but I didn't envy them having to wear all of that protective gear because it just looked like it would be so oppressive as far as the heat and trying to move and if you had to move fast, it wasn't going to happen. But the difference is, it would protect you much better too. So.
So when you were in South Korea, did you get any chance to experience any of the culture or any of the food? Or?
Yeah. We did. Our unit was, there were I think 14 or 15 of us, so we were pretty much when we weren't on duty, which was pretty much 8 to 5, we were allowed to, we weren't restricted to the base or anything, so we could leave the base and go in the village. And on weekends we'd go down to Seoul and go to nightclubs, see movies, go to some Buddhist temples just to see something different. I think we all took a trip up to the DMZ. As a tourist, you had to wear your uniform, and you had to, but you had, since you were in the military, but you could go up there. One highlight was this was in December in '72 when Bob Hope, the USO tour, he was still doing tours, and he was coming to Korea, and he was going to Camp Casey, and I think he had 2 shows in Korea, and the 2nd Infantry Division was, they were the focus of that, and we weren't allowed to go, or we weren't permitted to go supposedly, and we told Leon Reed and myself, he was another enlisted guy with me. We told him we were going to go up and see Bob Hope, and he said, "Well, no, you can't get in." No, well, don't worry, we'll get in. So we took our Jeep. We had EOD all over it, red, big red letters, EOD, and this and that. And so we just got to the front gate, and we just told them, "Hey, we're here to check out the stage for the Bob Hope tour," and so the MPs just said, "Okay, head over there, park over there." So we parked over there and walked around for a bit, and then we just plopped ourselves down in the front row and sat right. And so we had great seats to see Bob Hope in one of his last shows. So that was one of the highlights of being in South Korea for the year.
So were you able to keep in touch with your family? You're married at this time?
I got divorced when I was in Korea, but as far as communication, it wasn't like today, where you just get online. So it was a combination of writing letters, and it's primarily letters, and then once a month I'd splurge and make a long distance phone call, usually on a Sunday or something, to either talk to my parents or my sister. So, but wasn't big on letter writing, a few letters, but maybe a couple times a month, and then a call once a month or so. So.
I mean, now I don't mean to pry, but with you being deployed to South Korea, did that affect why you got divorced during this time?
No, I think that was, I don't think that caused it, but I think it was just the decision that, hey, this was not the right decision to make to begin with. So we both agreed. It was fairly amicable. I mean, it was easy enough to do. She'd hired a lawyer, and then I used a military lawyer, and it was more just signing the papers, and it was over with, and it was not much to it.
So no Dear John letter? Or?
No.
Okay, that's good.
No.
So were you only in South Korea then a year?
Actually, it was like 14 months. It was a 13-month assignment, and then I got extended for a month because I don't know how the military is now, but then it was if you were coming back from an overseas station and you had 5 months or left on your enlistment. I was on a 3-year enlistment. Then you didn't go to a new duty station. They just gave you what they called an early out. So I had like 6 months to go when my tour was up in South Korea. So they just extended it a month, and then I was got a 5-month early out from my 3-year enlistment.
So right when you were done with South Korea, you were done with the Army?
Yeah, I left on a chartered flight from Seoul, and I think I'm not sure, but I think it was Fort Ord went to, and then got processed out. So.
Was that during the downsizing, or did staying in as a career cross your mind?
It did cross my mind but I two things. When I first went into the service, I thought I might stay in the service, and then when I was in the service, I seriously considered it. But then when I never went to Vietnam, and I thought, and I had put in a couple requests, but it never came through because they were from 71 on, they were really cutting back on the number of people in Vietnam. And I thought, I would never have the career as someone who was a year or two ahead of me, who had a tour or two of Vietnam, with more opportunities to have that combat experience. They'd probably be on a faster promotion track and all that. So I thought this may not be the best for me. Plus, you hate to say it, but a little bit of an embarrassment that, hey, you're in the service, but you were never in Vietnam. So what's the deal here? How did that happen? And then also, when I was there, draft was going on, so you met a lot of people who, both enlisted and draftees. They had people who were, like me, just out of high school, but a lot of people who had college degrees, and talking to officers who, were maybe OCS or ROTC, and you look around and say, hey, man, I'm as smart as these guys, and I should be able to, do a lot with my life. And it was more that, hey, they got an education, they went back and they either had a degree before they went in the service, or they were halfway through. And I thought, I need to concentrate on getting an education, because that's going to make a difference. Because I could see right away in the Army, that education was very valued, and I had a couple, for lack of a better word, mentors, whether they were, officers in my unit or senior enlisted people, said, you need to really consider going to school, because that's going to make a big difference. And so I had pretty well decided by the time I was in Korea that when I got out of the service, I was going to go to school and use the GI Bill and take it from there. So.
All right. So did you have a school in mind when you were?
I didn't. Other than school, but being from the Dayton area, and then I got out of the service, and Wright State at the time was pretty much open enrollment. If you had a pulse, you could get in. So and not having a lot of money, but having the GI Bill and being familiar with the area, I said, well, I'm just gonna enroll at Wright State, and it ended up being a great experience for me. So.
So what did you study when you were at Wright State?
I studied accounting. I pretty well knew when I started that I wanted to be an accounting major. I had some basic bookkeeping classes and stuff in high school and my teachers there had encouraged me. They thought I had an aptitude for business and math, and so I knew pretty much from the get-go that when I came to Wright State, I would major in accounting. So.
I know for me, when I came back, since I was a scout in the Army, none of that really transferred over to civilian life at all. Did you kind of feel the same way with being EOD?
Yeah, I don't think there was, I think if I had, there'd probably been one career where that it may have made some sense, and that would have been like a demolition construction type of operation. But for a general business environment, I mean, the skills you learned, the technical skills you learned, no, they didn't transfer over. But I think the Army in itself and the service in general, what to me was a great training ground before I started college, because when I was 18, if I'd gone straight to college, it'd have been a lot different than when I was 21 when I did go to college, because I was a lot more serious, and I was a lot more mature, and didn't take things for granted and say, hey, this is an opportunity. You got to get the most out of it. You're paying us money to go to school. Get a good grade. Just don't get through it and party. And so in general, just being in the Army gave me an opportunity to see that I had a lot more potential. I think some of that went back to being picked out to go into EOD, because they sold it as a special unit. You had to be a quote above average intelligence, things like that. You had to have certain skills, and it was the first time I'd kind of been picked out as saying, hey, you're something special. You got some good skills here, and that's we think you can do a good job. So the Army, in that sense, gave me a lot of encouragement in my ability to be successful.
So going from South Korea EOD to Wright State accounting, I mean, how was that transition?
Yeah, it wasn't a hard transition. I got out of the service in April of '73, so I came back to Dayton, and then I knew I was going to start school, but it wasn't going to be until the fall. So I ended up getting a job just as an assistant manager in the Dayton Mall, and trying to figure it out. But that worked for about a month or two, and then I said, I'm just going to take some time off, and so I'd bought a car with what I'd saved over when I was in the service, and I just took off one day, and I called my boss and said, hey, I won't be in the day I'm in Illinois, and I'm heading west. And so I did like a 3-month just travel in the U.S. on my own, just to kind of see things, and timed it so I got back in the fall, and then applied to Wright State. And then and when I started school, it wasn't a hard transition, and I don't think it's like it is today for the vets getting out. It seems to be a lot more difficult, but back then for me it wasn't. And here at Wright State, it was close to Wright Pat, so there were a lot of active duty military people here taking classes, and there were all with the draft going on and the Army being much larger, than there were a lot of local people who were out of the service, out of the Army, Air Force, that friends I knew who were in school here, and so you kind of gravitate to the people you know. So most of my friends ended up being, or a lot of friends ended up being, other veterans and stuff who had completed their service and were starting their education.
So I'm going to jump back here. You said you went on just a 3-month trip after you came back. So what motivated that, and what did you do on that trip?
I think it was more just hey, I just need to get away and clear my head and decide what I want to do. I mean, it wasn't like I had any traumatic combat experiences or anything like that, but it was more like, okay, I'm getting ready to start a new path of my life here, and I want to make clear on what I want to do. And before I get too bogged down in school and routine, I may not have this advantage again to just be free to do some things. And then there were several Army buddies who I'd served with, and a couple were still in the service, and a couple were out. So I had destinations, so I would stop and see them on the way in Iowa, and then in Utah, and then I was out in Arizona, and then back to Florida.
So you said how you would gravitate towards people who are in the military, so other veterans. Do you think that helped you transition to just be more around veterans?
I think it did. I mean, and I don't know if it was so much the veterans, or they were just my age. They were 3 or 4 years older than the 18-year-old college freshman. So you just had more maybe common life experiences, whether it was in the military or not. But I think just hanging out with people who had served, and it was something you had in common, and certain lingo and language, the way you talk, the way you think, a lot of times it just they could understand some things that maybe you were going through that others weren't.
So then, did you just get your undergrad at Wright State?
I got my undergraduate at Wright State, and that's where I met my second and still wife, who we've been married over 40 years, and we met here at Wright State in the Quad area, actually. We actually met in a computer science class at the time, before they even had computer science as a major. It was a card punching class and stuff, learning how to write Fortran, and so we met there, and then dated through college, and then when she graduated in June of '76, we got married, and then I graduated in December '76, and then I had a job offer to go to Houston, Texas, so we moved to Texas at that time.
And then, what was the job in Texas that you took?
It was a internal audit with Exxon, and it was when I was at school here, I was I didn't want to work for an accounting firm. I just wanted to work for a corporation, and then I thought something in the energy business, and so sent out resumes around the country, and they invited me down for an interview and made me an offer. So, I was kind of the mindset. I think it was because when my parents migrated from Tennessee to Ohio, all my grandparents and most of my relatives were in Tennessee, and I always kind of thought, well, when you become an adult, when you get a job, you're supposed to move away and do something different. So that was kind of in the back of my mind too. I think it was kind of driving me to say, hey, let's try something different. So that's why we went to Texas, and we've actually stayed there for the most part for the next 40 years.
So, are you still in contact with anyone you served with?
Actually, I am. And just this past summer, Leon, who I'd mentioned before earlier, he and I were both E5s in the EOD unit in South Korea, and I'd looked him up on the internet and connected with him, and we were out in my wife and I were out in Arizona earlier this year, and he and I got together for dinner and visited, and a couple other guys I served with too were one's in Detroit, and we were scheduled to get together, but then I didn't make it up to Detroit, so eventually we will. And there was another guy in Chicago that I'd served with and unfortunately there was one, my CO, or actually he's my XO, Captain Rodenberg, and he was in El Paso, and I found him on the internet and looked him up, and I found, well, he didn't have an email address or anything, but there was a Korean restaurant that he was the owner of, he and his wife. And I didn't know he had married a Korean woman, but I looked him up, and actually went to the restaurant and talked to his wife, and she was so excited. Hey, he's going to be great to see you. He'd love to see you. And she gave me his phone number, and then I texted him, and he texted back and said, he goes, I really don't remember anything from that time period, and I really don't want to talk to you, but best of luck. So I said, okay, So I don't know if he was having, some memory issues or what, but I'm sorry I didn't get to visit with him. So.
Did you join any veterans organization?
I never did. No, I've never liked the American Legion or VFW or anything like that. No.
Okay. So I have a couple more reflection questions for you. How would you say that your wartime experience affected your life?
Well, I think it affected me, as I kind of alluded to before. I think it gave me a sense of purpose when I was in the service, and the Army gave me an opportunity that that I probably would have had without them, but I realized it when I was in the Army, and it allowed me to grow both emotionally and intellectually in the service. And it also, the GI Bill, I think, was a big deal, because while at the time I was getting $220 a month in benefits to go to Wright State here, that doesn't sound like a lot, but school was only like $750 a quarter then, so it pretty well covered all of my school expenses at the time. And I got through school in 3 years, so I was able to use it. I was able to have that benefit the whole way through school. So that made a big difference to me. And in general, I just think whether you're in a service or some type of civilian AmeriCorps or something, I'm a big believer in universal service of some type, whether it's a draft or something, but I think it's a way for people to not be so afraid of other people and different. I mean, it's a real equalizer. The service is a big equalizer, because you come in, black, white, Hispanic, educated, uneducated, whatever. You're all there together, and you have to work together. And it's a team effort, and you get to see how other people with different different viewpoints and stuff. You got to work together. You got to get along, but it's you're not in your cocoon where you're always in the private school or always in the maybe a high income area where you never associate with other people. So I'm all for some type of service for everyone. So.
How has your military service impacted your feelings about war and the military in general?
Yeah, and in military in general, you know, you have to have a military. I think it's important. I think you know, I think a professional army is important to have. Deterrence is a big, has a lot to say for it. If you have the big hammer there, it maybe keeps people from doing some crazy things. I would prefer there not be wars. I thought the invading Iraq was crazy. I just didn't believe that there was, that Saddam had those types of weapons, and I was a lot more agreeable with what was going on in Afghanistan because of the Taliban and what was going on. But what you end up finding out is you got to have an exit plan, and you got to. I think the other thing that with what was so different, the military, they had a plan. I mean, they could win the war, but then what did they do after that? I mean, there was no plan to who's going to be in charge, who's going to run it, and the fact that our technology is so advanced and so great. All of these thousands and thousands and thousands of vets who in years past would have died on the battlefield actually lived and survived, and then they come back and then it just swamped the VAs, and they just can't take care of the people like they should, and it's just I mean, I think it's just terrible that they didn't have the Army didn't have the foresight, or the military in general, the foresight to say, hey, we got to have a program in place here to take care of these people when they do come back, because it's gonna it's gonna be different than previous wars, and it just I guess it's getting better, but it's still it's just gonna be a long slog.
I only have a couple more questions left. Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed or should be added to this interview?
No, I don't think so. But I think yeah, in general, I'd say my time in the service was positive, and it was I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't have my military service. I'm proud of the fact that I served. While I wasn't in a combat unit, I still feel that I contributed, and I'm glad I did. I think if I hadn't done it, I would. From the time I didn't until today, I would feel like I had missed something, that that was an opportunity that I didn't take advantage of, that I should have, and so I'm happy I did, and I'm happy the way things have turned out for me. So.
Okay. And we'll end it on this final question. What message would you like to leave for future generations who will view this interview?
I'd say, as far as to take away from this, that there's for every person in the military, there's a unique story, and everyone has a contribution to make.